Hello and welcome to The Green Room by Deloitte, an award-winning podcast where we explore the topics that matter most in business. I'm Ethan Worth, and this is episode number 48, where we ask, what's the secret to changing behaviours?
Thinking is to humans as swimming is to cats. We can do it, but we'd rather not.
People being taken advantage of in that case.
And just by doing that, the number of members that were in a sustainability tilted fund went from 3% to 90%.
Don't go out and say, most of you idiots are using the plane, stop it, you should be using the train.
And today I'm joined by Lizzie. How are you, Lizzie? And look at us in our brand new studio.
How exciting is this? We're actually in person, brand new studio, lights, camera, action.
I know, we have cameras. We're now on YouTube, so we're being filmed.
Yeah, my 11-year-old is very excited that his mother is getting to be a YouTuber.
YouTube superstar.
As long as I don't have to start, entering boxing matches or anything like that, I think we'll be all right.
Very nice and current reference. And yeah, our change of environment, and very fittingly, we're talking about changing behaviours and why it's so difficult. And to help us through that, we're joined by a behavioural scientist and a climate expert to look at what are some of those those psychological biases that lead to the decisions we make.
Indeed.
And why is it so difficult to change things when it comes to tackling the climate crisis?
Yeah, it's going to be a really interesting conversation. I can't wait to get stuck in.
Do you want to introduce our guest, Lizzie?
Absolutely. So I'm delighted to introduce Richard Shotton, first of all. Richard is the founder of Astro10, a consultancy that applies findings from behavioural science to marketing. Richard's career began in media planning over 18 years ago, where he worked with brands like Coke, Lexus, and Compare the Market, before finding his niche in behavioural science. His first book, The Choice Factory, debuted in 2015, and his second book, The Illusion of Choice, was published earlier in March this year. Richard, welcome.
Very nice to see you.
Lovely to see you too. We're also joined by Stuart West. Stuart is the UK net zero lead within Deloitte's internal sustainability team, World Climate. He plays a leading role in making sustainable delivery our default way of doing business and promoting sustainability through our supply chain. Before joining the firm, Stuart spent several years working on climate and energy issues within the UK civil service, most recently helping to facilitate consensus agreement at COP26 in Glasgow in 2021 as the UK's head of UN climate change negotiations strategy. Stuart, fantastic to have you in the green room.
Good to be here.
Great to have you both here. And I think just to kick it off, let's start with a bit of a broader question. So how would you define change and what does change mean to you?
So I think change from a behavioural science perspective is something that's quite hard. I mean, half the time people are not weighing up and considering their decisions. There's a lovely phrase from a Princeton psychologist called Susan Fiske, who says we're cognitive misers. What she means by that is it's energy intensive and effortful to think. So because energy is a precious resource, we ration that, and where possible, we avoid deep considered thought, and instead we either rely on what psychologists call heuristics, quick rules of thumb for making decisions, or we rely on habits. We just keep on repeating the same behaviour again and again. So I think from a behavioural science perspective, change is hard. It's something that if you want to change behaviour, you've got to recognise you're working against human nature.
We're cognitively lazy almost.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a wonderful phrase from Daniel Kahneman where he says, thinking is to humans as swimming is to cats. We can do it, but we'd rather not.
Someone else. Yeah. Interesting. What about yourself, Stuart? What are your thoughts about change?
I think it's the only constant, as they say. So it's happening to us, and we are changing, and it's just part of life, and part of it is a conscious choice, but a big part of it is subconscious or done to us in a way.
Yes. So this is what I was thinking about last night when I was thinking, what is change? Because I was thinking it's almost like there's three categories. There's the change that sort of creeps up on us that you might not necessarily decide on, but it just sort of happens. And then there's conscious decisions, like you say. And then I guess there are choices that are made for you, like putting up a 20 mile an hour speed zone where it used to be a 30 mile an hour speed zone. I guess there's just different aspects to change in that regard.
And then how about behavioural science? What does that mean?
So it's probably what we used to call social psychology.
Yeah.
I would define it as the study of how people actually behave rather than how they claim to behave. And there's often a big difference between those two things. So yeah, it's this broad idea that we're so overwhelmed with choice that people don't weigh up every single decision, and instead they rely on these quick rules of thumb to make fast decisions. Now, what's interesting, if you want to change behaviour, whether it's to encourage an environmental choice or if you're a brand to encourage people to buy your product, if you are aware of people's mental rules of thumb, when you are designing your communications, designing these programs, you can essentially work with human nature rather than against it. So it's this giant compendium of insights and experiments into how to effectively change people's behaviour.
Are people being taken advantage of in that case, or is it more just, as you say, working with the way their brains work?
I think behavioural science itself is neutral. It's a tool. It could be used to manipulate people. It's just a tool for how you effectively change people. So you could make the parallel with rhetoric. There are various thoughts about how to communicate effectively, but it's up to the communicator whether they use that for good or ill. You can use rhetoric to inspire people to great deeds. You can use rhetoric to inspire people to hate each other. So the tool itself, I think, is neutral. What ends it's put to depends on the persuader.
And I think it does have almost a dark or Machiavellian sound to it. And some people talk about behaviour change, but it's not really that. It's about how you communicate to someone. It's about removing friction in their everyday life. You're changing the environment in which they make their choices and go about their daily lives, and changing the broader system in which they operate. So it's just part of everyday life. It's not something coercive or overly persuasive. It's just hopefully making the right choices easier is a big part of it.
And presumably one of the potential applications of behaviour science is when it comes to addressing the climate crisis. So Stuart, what's your feeling on we have all the information, we've been repeatedly told the catastrophic effects that are down the line. Why do you think it's proving so difficult to change people's behaviour in this space?
I think people care about climate change, particularly in this country. Last year, the UK Public Attitudes Tracker showed that at least 80% of people in the UK at least are fairly concerned about climate change, if not very concerned. But the challenge is really inducing agency to do something about it, which requires an awareness of what they can do about it and what steps really will make a change in fighting the climate crisis. But then it's also making those choices as easy as possible. So part of that is appealing to that agency and helping people understand concretely what they can do to help fight climate change. But it's also, as I was saying before, changing the choice environment so those more climate-friendly options are easier, are cheaper, are more accessible, and then at the same time making clear that it's not on the shoulders of individuals alone to be fixing a complex global problem like this. There are broader systemic challenges and systemic dimensions to this, and that's why we need an all-of-society approach with government, business, and other stakeholders playing a really active role.
Yeah, preventing that sense, I guess, of feeling overwhelmed, but actually able to make some choices. So I guess we'll probably come on to that. And Richard, what's your sort of take on that, and kind of why we are where we are today, and how behavioural science might help people to change their behaviours?
I think behavioural science is a useful tactic to apply something like climate change, in that there is often a belief amongst people that the best way to change behaviour is to educate people, to give them information. But remember that broad argument of people are cognitive misers, that they're not weighing up every decision by drawing on all the possible information. They're making snap decisions when they're considering what car to get, what to order, whether it's beef or vegetables at a restaurant. So behavioural science would say, well, alongside some of that education, maybe there are different tactics you can draw on. So, for example, there's a wonderful study from a psychologist at Arizona State University called Robert Cialdini, and he worked with a hotel chain in Southwest USA. And back in 2008, he persuades this hotel to let him alter the messages in guest rooms, encouraging them to reuse their towels. And sometimes he runs messages that say, please reuse your towels, it's good for the environment. And when he does that, 35% of guests do so. Other times he runs messages that say, please reuse your towels, most guests do so. And in that setting, there's no mention of the environment, there's no logical, rational reason for complying. There is I think it's a 9 percentage point increase in compliance. So you're up to 44% of people reusing their towel. So his argument would be, even if 80% of people say that they are interested in the environment, that there are study after study saying, well, maybe sometimes the better way to persuade people is not to appeal to their better selves, it's to let them know what others are doing. And there is a repeated theme in behavioural science called social proof, that if you make a behaviour appear popular, that behaviour will become more appealing, more people are likely to do it. So if you want people to order vegan dishes, don't necessarily default to thinking, tell them about the CO2 footprint or the benefit to their body. Talk about the more and more people are doing that. So it introduces a very different set of tactics for trying to change behaviour.
With herd mentality, isn't it? And safety in numbers.
Yeah, that's it. That's exactly it. Yeah, this idea that we're a social animal.
Yeah.
I think I heard you talk about Red Bull or something when they first launched. Didn't they go to nightclubs and crush Red Bull?
Yeah.
Them in the bins to kind of look, cool people who go to nightclubs, they drink Red Bull, kind of plant that seed in people.
Yeah, there's a story that, as you say, but when they were launching, rather than go out and tell people about their amazing potency, they went down to nightclubs. Before those nightclubs kicked people out, they would fill up the bins nearby and with old crushed Red Bull cans. So as people left, they thought that everyone else was drinking Red Bull. They thought this was a super popular drink. And people used that badge of popularity as a shortcut for a sensible choice. So I think the Red Bull is an interesting example. I mean, that's probably not the most ethical example, purposely misled.
Yeah, true, not for climate change.
But going back to this point of behavioural science just a tool, you can take that same principle of social proof and the same principle of applying it laterally. Like, they didn't go and say loads of people drink Red Bull. They created the impression that people did. You could take that same principle and apply it for sustainable behaviour change. And I think that's what the government tried to do. Slightly, I don't think it was executed very well, but it was a brilliant idea, which was green number plates for electric cars. Because prior to those, you had no idea what engine people were using. Your car drives past, could be anything. Could be petrol, could be diesel. Once you highlight electric cars, once you make them visible, once you make them noticeable, you create this impression that there are far more of them on the roads. And that will create this virtuous circle of social proof.
Stuart, you mentioned about the kind of making it easier for people. And I know, Rich, one of the things you talk about is kind of removing friction. I don't know if you've got any examples, Stuart, from a kind of climate perspective, how removing some of those barriers might make people more inclined to kind of make more sustainable choices.
I guess a good one is the power of the default. So, if you're giving people lots and lots of options for things to do, you are appealing to their agency and empowering them to make a choice, but you're also at risk of overwhelming them with what the most climate-friendly choice might be. So with the power of the default, actually, if you make the most climate-friendly option the main one,
and perhaps the easiest one,
there is no, they have to work harder to do something less climate-friendly than they do to do something climate-friendly. So, for example, here at Deloitte, back in the summer of 2021, we changed our default pension scheme so that by default you would be investing your pension in a sustainability tilted fund, and just by doing that, the number of members that were in a sustainability tilted fund went from 3% to 90%, and so that has a massive impact for a firm like Deloitte with the number of members and the size of pension pot.
I mean, for me, that feels almost like, thank goodness the choice is being taken away. It's much easier for me. So is there a role for more of that? If it was illegal to use a plastic bag, as they've done in Kenya, for example, they just got rid of plastic bags, didn't they? And now everyone, it's almost like a different lifetime away. Can there be more of that? Is that a way that we can get people to change? Is actually by reducing options or making options mandated?
Definitely, but going back to my point of those layers, on the one hand, it's about making choices easier for people and providing the education on the impact of different things. But on the other hand, it's really important that we address some of those more systemic drivers of climate change. So, for example, with EVs, yes, we can try to educate the public about the benefits of EVs, and yes, we can change the choice environment so that EVs are easier to find and kind of there are salient nudges in encouraging that. But we also need to be doing the big stuff, and so, for example, encouraging internal combustion engine phase-out dates amongst countries, but also amongst car manufacturers, and changing the infrastructure, the environment in which we drive our cars, so that EVs are the winning choice. So you need to have that blend, and I think the responsibility can't lie solely on the individual's kind of choices.
So we've begun discussing this principle of make it easy, and I think it's a really good place to talk about, because there are two recent Nobel Prize winners in economics who have got behavioural science background, Richard Shotton and Daniel Kahneman. And interestingly, when they're put on the spot and asked to prioritise the findings from their research, what's the most important thing that they've discovered, they answer in the same way. They say 3 words: make it easy. If you remove bits of friction, it's not just that it encourages behaviour, it encourages it in a way that is disproportionate to the removal of friction, that often a tiny, tiny bit of friction can have an outsized effect. So one study that sticks in my mind is there's a study by Paul Rosen, and he runs an experiment in a cafeteria, and they want to encourage people to order more healthily. So sometimes they put the vegetables in bowls close to the diners, sometimes they're 6 inches away. Sometimes they put tongs in the bowls, sometimes spoons. And what he finds is, even with those tiny changes, it's not that much easier to use a spoon than a tong. Even with those tiny changes, there's like a 6 to 7% increase in vegetable purchasing. So what tends to happen is, when people want to encourage sustainable behaviours, they think, how can I motivate the audience to really be enthused about helping save the environment? Behavioural scientists say, well, look, before you do that, go through like the product journey or whatever it is you're trying to encourage, and just try and identify the tiniest bits of friction that are stopping people behaving the way that you want. And if you put efforts into removing those, it will have a bigger than expected effect. So I think, yes, start with that principle of what are the blockages, aim to remove those, and once you've done that, then think about appeal and motivation, all the other nudges that you could use.
Interesting. I guess when you're talking about sort of nudges and how we can influence behaviour, obviously a lot of what we're talking about people might associate with advertising, Richard. I'm just wondering if we could have a bit of a chat about sort of some stories around how it's used through advertising, and then maybe, whether that's something that we could learn to sort of help people make better climate choices as well.
Yeah, there's a long history of advertising agencies using principles from psychology. One of my favourites is the pratfall effect. So it's this idea from...
I was wondering if I should accidentally spill my coffee all over you today, but I decided against it.
So it's this idea from Elliot Aronson, who's at Harvard, that if you admit a flaw, you become more appealing.
Yeah.
Now, if you think about the greatest ever ad campaigns, it's amazing how often that idea turns up. Stella, reassuringly expensive. Yeah. Marmite, half the population hate us. Yeah. Guinness, good things come to those who wait. VW, ugly as only skin deep. Now, company after company have recognised this point, that if you admit a flaw, you tend to become more appealing. So it's a brilliant tactic, I think, for advertisers, because you can often identify a flaw that has a mirror strength. So if you're Stella and you say you're expensive, people immediately see, well, if you're expensive, you must be higher quality.
Yes.
Or if you're Guinness, well, if it takes that long to make, surely it
must be really good.
Yeah, it must be a premium brand.
Yeah.
So if you choose your flaw carefully, you can often make the product more appealing. So that's a tactic that I think some of the best advertisers have used over the years.
Interesting. And so how does that sort of resonate with you? How do you think that could be used?
So much about taking action on climate change is a win-win. And so trying to kind of use that in novel ways and communicate some of the benefits, but in a playful or fun way, I think is something that would be humanizing for the climate action agenda.
Yeah, and we interviewed Colin Butfield about a year ago now, I think, who's one of the producers on the Our Planet documentary. And his big message was, it's all about comms. So that thing that you said, that actually it's pretty win-win, rather than going down the kind of the doomsday route. Maybe what we need to do is sell it and show kind of what you're gaining, not really what you're losing. Do you think is that something that resonates with you?
Definitely, but I think something that has changed over the last few years is people's awareness and how much they care about climate change. So I think there's a subtle difference between trying to convince people to take action by, over-egging all of the benefits associated with doing so, and communicating in a balanced way the co-benefits of climate action, because people are motivated to take action on climate change. The level of people that care about climate in the UK doubled from 2016 to 2022. So we shouldn't be afraid to appeal based on arguments of this will contribute to the fight against climate change, and also the moral arguments are very compelling as well. There was a behavioural insights team study in the lead up to COP26, and they found that across all 7 segments, the most compelling framings of the issue were the environmental ones and the moral ones, rather than the economic or the health ones, in terms of spurring people to engage more actively with COP26 and kind of show that they wanted to engage. So yes, focus on the co-benefits. Yes, help make climate action relevant for people and connect it to what they care about. But there isn't so much of a need to justify climate action through the lens of other things like, you're not fighting climate change, don't worry, you're getting a better job, or you're saving money. All of those things are great, but I don't think we need to kind of over-egg them at the expense of helping people to realise how their action actually helps the fundamental cause.
Makes sense. And one of the things I remember you talking about, Richard, in something that I was listening to in the build-up to this, is something around the relatability factor. So if you maybe get a statistic of 3 million people are hungry or something, or you get a story about one child that can't afford to eat, it's that being able to relate to a single person might make it more effective. And I guess one of the things that I was thinking about with that is, in a previous episode, we spoke to a founder of a zero-waste supermarket, and he said that there was something tangible about plastic, and that when Blue Planet came out and you could see that here is a bird that's eaten X amount of plastic, it really was a bit of a watershed moment for the movement against that. Do you think that's an example of perhaps where behavioural psychology is influencing the climate movement?
What's, I think, undeniable is your point around the difference in impact between stories over statistics. There's a lovely study from a psychologist called Slovich, and he coined the phrase the identifiable victim effect. So in his study, it was quite a clever study, because I think they have a setup where there's a kind of a dummy experiment. So people think the experiment's over, and at the end they're paid, I think, say $5, and told, well, at the end of the experiment, what we normally do is give you the chance to donate some of that fee to charity. And half the people are told about malnutrition in, I think, Mali. Hundreds of thousands of people dying, all these issues. The other half are told the story of a single girl called Rokia. And when they're given each of the participants is given the chance to donate money afterwards, there's something of the order of a doubling in terms of volume of donation amongst the people who've had the individual story rather than those dry statistics. And the broad finding, I think, is that statistics tend to leave us cold. We can't conceptualise 1 million people or 500,000 people. But what we can relate to is a story of a single girl. That's something that features in our lives.
Just as a quick pause in the conversation, did you know at Deloitte we support social enterprises through our 5 Million Futures programme? Like Loaf Catering, part of Now Group in Northern Ireland. They support people with learning difficulties and autism into jobs for the future. If you're based in Belfast, you can now order Loaf's delicious food to go. If you're further away, just visit loafcatering.com, where you'll find beautiful mugs handmade by Loaf's in-house potter. Now, back to our topic of the day.
We've touched on kind of systemic change and the importance of kind of companies and organisations as well as individuals. And obviously, Stuart, you helped facilitate the COP26 negotiations, and also as part of that went through a big change yourself, with it being delayed for COVID, as someone who's definitely experienced a change. Is there anything that you learned from that, or kind of give us a bit of a glimpse behind the scenes in those negotiations?
Yeah, I think obviously it's a completely different sense of scale from how can you as an individual take tangible action on climate change to how can you bring close to 200 countries from radically different geographies, radically different social contexts, radically different economic development status together and achieve a consensus agreement on something as complex as climate change, which is first and foremost an environmental issue, but also those negotiations are effectively about how are we going to reconfigure the global economy and how are we going to reshape our societies so that we can live in harmony with nature. And that's a really complex thing to do.
And begin.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why the former UK and EU lead negotiator, Pete Betts, used to always say, process is substance in this process. And it kind of pointed to the fact that, like changing someone's choice environment, the way in which you structure the negotiations and the manner in which you ensure that they're transparent and inclusive, and the way in which you compartmentalize and break down the global issue into what action do we need to take to mitigate emissions, what action do we need to take to build our resilience to climate impacts, how are we going to finance all of these actions, how are we going to work together and hold each other accountable for the actions we're each expecting one another to take. Doing all of that is so critical to take a complex issue and actually drive progress and reach consensus agreement on how we're going to tackle it. So, when you get to a COP, you really need to have rallied people around a vision for what we're trying to achieve, really paint a compelling narrative around the impact that the COP needs to have. And then you need to, in a really inclusive, in a really deliberate, in a really controlled manner, bring people around that vision and kind of really show how it's aligned with the climate science, is aligned with what objective experts are telling us is required if we want to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. But it's also inclusive and balanced. And, you need countries to leave a negotiation like that seeing the impact of what the negotiations will be, and whilst not having 100% of what they want, at least leaving with something or a few things that they can take back to their capital and say, this was important to us and we got it.
This is a win, yeah. That makes sense.
There's often a belief that members of the public behave differently from professional groups or professional organisations. But there's a broad theme that most of the biases or insights that have been proven to work on citizens work on professionals. The only difference really is professionals are even more adamant that they are not affected by these nudges. So one big theme would be, if you're interested in what actually influences people, you can't question them directly. If you think of all the studies we've talked about, it's never a psychologist going and saying, what would influence you to change your behaviour? Which of these two messages would work? You set up a natural environment. You keep everything the same between the two settings, apart from one variable, and any difference in behaviour you attribute back to that single change variable.
So, Richard, that's interesting, thinking about sort of professionals versus individuals. And Stuart, in terms of how sort of professional organisations can support, for example, sustainable delivery, it'd be great to hear a bit from yourself about your experience with that.
Yeah, it's a very timely question because it's a big focus for us at the moment. We're obviously a professional services firm. We don't make bricks or bars of soap, and so in terms of our own emissions footprint, business travel is a critical contributor. And so a big thing that we're working through at the moment is how can we make sure that how we deliver our core services, regardless of what the focus of that project is as sustainable as possible. And so, as you say, we're thinking a lot about sustainable delivery, and from a kind of a framing perspective, we're deliberately focusing on this concept of sustainable delivery and trying to help our people understand that the positive vision of what we're trying to create, which is a sustainable way of doing business, regardless of whether you're working on an ESG focused project or something nothing to do with climate action, so that people see that they can make a meaningful contribution, regardless of the work that they're doing. And so to help with that, we've developed a few key tools, one of which was a travel emissions calculator, which basically helped people to break the cycle of just assuming, okay, client project, travel to client site, and actually prompt people by using the tool to think through some key questions around, is travel even required? And if travel is required, is the standard number of people required? And is the standard frequency required? And what are the different modes of transport I could be using? What are the classes of transport? Because all of these things impact business travel emissions. And so building this tool to raise awareness, but also within it, including a number of nudges that help people choose the more low carbon option, is a really kind of key part of the campaign. And it's actually on Deloitte's website and available for public use. But again, talking about those layers of raising awareness and helping people to use their agency, but also then making it easy for them, we've tried to do a few things to change the choice architecture. So for example, when you book travel in the UK firm, the low carbon option is at the top of the list, and it's really clearly flagged to try to encourage people, given that the salience of it, the accessibility of it, to make that choice. And also things like making a new sustainable delivery clause that listeners might have read about in the FT and other newspapers over Christmas, where front and center in our engagement letters with clients, we're starting to talk about our commitment to sustainable delivery and use of these tools and kind of prioritization of low carbon transport options when travel is required, to make sure that we're bringing down our travel related emissions, which is also important for our clients because our business travel emissions are a scope 3 burden for them. And so we're trying to be proactive about this, but are definitely on a journey and still learning.
It's so interesting hearing about Clause Zero. And I guess the question is, how do you actually implement it? How do we get people to respond to it and to implement it?
First of all, and going back to some of the points that have been made already, you try to remove the choice to some extent, and we've done that by making it the default in our engagement letters for clients. So we're putting it front and center in there, as I said just now. We're also equipping our people with kind of support and talking points to support how they engage the client about this, and making it social by creating a conversation about sustainable delivery, but also about sustainability more broadly. And then finally, we are kind of sharing stories of sustainable delivery and kind of helping people across the firm see other people like them engaging clients about sustainable delivery and having positive conversations as a result, which will build the confidence of people to go out and have those same conversations themselves.
So I think we're kind of approaching the end of the episode, but it'd be good to get some kind of final tips. So Richard, have you got any final tips for changing behaviours and influencing key stakeholders?
So there are thousands of different behavioural science studies, so it can feel a little overwhelming to use behavioural science. So I'd recommend that people used a simple framework for applying it. So there are lots of different frameworks, but the one from the Behavioural Insights team, who are associated with the British government, is called EAST. And they split behavioural science down into 4 key principles. So it's an acronym: make it easy, make it attractive, make it social, and make it timely. So if you're ever facing a challenge and you want to change someone's behaviour, think how to make the desired behaviour as easy as possible. These little bits of friction, they might feel inconsequential, but all the evidence suggests they have an outsized effect. Then I would think about how to make the desired behaviour as attractive as possible. Now that's quite a broad area, but it might be, for example, thinking about who is the messenger going to be, who is the voice that's trying to persuade. And actually there are arguments that it's not just what you say, it's who says it that's important. So picking a communicator who is either authoritative, relatable, or neutral is often a powerful technique. Then you've got this idea of social, and that, not around social media necessarily, but more this idea of social proof. How do you make the behaviour you're trying to encourage appear as popular as possible? And of all the studies we've discussed, that's probably the one where there's the broadest, widest, most robust evidence that it's effective. So make sure, firstly, that you are not inadvertently making the unwanted behaviour appear popular. So in an organisation, you talk about travel emissions, whatever you do, don't go out and say, most of you idiots are using the plane, stop it, you should be using the train. If you go out and tell people loads of others are behaving the wrong way, you'll make the situation worse. So make sure you're creating a sense of popularity about the thing you want to encourage. And then an area we didn't discuss much, but is important, is this T of D's framework, timeliness. The idea that we are habitual creatures. So a remark about the time, we are not thinking about change, and we're therefore very hard to influence. But there are predictable moments when people are open to change. So and there's basically been a bit of disruption. If you enter a new time period, for example, there's an idea from Catherine Milkman called the fresh start effect. We are most open to change our behaviour when we enter a new time period. So reach people at the beginning of the week, beginning of the month, beginning of the year, after their birthdays. These are all moments when there's a greater openness to change.
And why people join the gym on the 1st of January.
Yes, and then, with that example, lots of people don't continue that behaviour. It's right back to where we start at the beginning. Behaviour change is hard. But it is easier to change behaviour in January than it will be in March, because people feel that they don't like to feel they're inconsistent with their past selves. But Milton's argument is, as we enter these new time periods, our link with our past self is weakened, we're just a little bit more open to change.
They're an example about prisoners on their birthday or something.
Yes. I'm not sure, I think it might be criminals. There's a West End police example where they try to break the kind of cycle of crime. So people who were well known to them, who'd been in trouble with the law, half of them were told about a confidential service that would help them get new jobs, get training to break this life of crime. And I think it was of the order of about 2.5% of people who were just randomly messaged through the year enrolled for this confidential service. The other group of people, they applied this fresh start effect. They sent them emails after their birthdays, and they saw a 50% improvement in enrolment rates. So the vast majority of people still ignored the email, but it was up to 4%, 4.05, I think, of people enrolled in the program. So yeah, lovely. I forgot about that study. It's a lovely example of, even the most hard to change groups, who could be hard to change as a criminal, even these groups, if you apply some of the principles, it doesn't make your intervention perfect, but it increases the impact, increases the probability of success.
Rich, thank you. I think it's always helpful to have a bit of a framework and some top tips to relate to. And on that note, Stuart, in terms of leaving our listeners, our viewers, with some top tips that they can take on board and apply as they sort of play their own role in solving the climate emergency, what would those be?
I think I'd grasp that word of emergency first and just say, yes, climate change is a complex global problem that we need to address urgently. But we as humanity have faced complex, scary problems before and overcome them. And so we need to retain the urgency, but also retain a sense of optimism that we can do this and importantly, focus on solutions. And when it comes to solutions, I think studies have shown that we are at risk of placing disproportionate importance on some of the slightly lower impact gestures like turning off your lights or recycling, which are really important and people should do them, but they aren't the answer in isolation. And actually work from the Committee on Climate Change and other key actors in the UK have shown that actually some of the bigger choices that involve a bit of individual choice, but also some supply side measures like shifting cars from the internal combustion engine to electric vehicles, like getting people to install heat pumps to heat their homes. Those are some of the more material impacts. But changing consumer habits is really important too. And one of the most impactful areas there is reducing our international flights, but also changing our diets to one that is more plant-based. So those are some of the most impactful things that we as individuals can do. And the final thing I'd say is, no one in the world can unilaterally decide to live in a net zero, nature positive society. And actually our goal isn't self-perfection, but it's systemic change. And so we really need to retain that focus on those, all of society, all of the above approaches with government, business, civil society, and all of the other actors playing a really heavy role as well.
Amazing. And final wrap up, the big question, we end all our podcasts on this. So just in one sentence, what's the secret to changing behaviours?
prioritise how observe behaviour over claim data.
Nice.
Don't listen to what people say. Run simple experiments to see what genuinely influences them. And many of those experiments can be inspired by behavioural science. So that was one sentence that became three.
Shit.
I'd say inspire through solutions and storytelling, remove the friction, and drive that systemic change.
I know.
Fabulous.
Thanks both for joining.
Thank you. It's fascinating. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Green Room by Deloitte. We'll be back next time with another big question. This podcast is produced by our very own pod squad and hosted by George Parrott, Lizzie Elston and Ethan Worth. Thanks to our creative studio for their technical support. Original music by Ali Barrett from our consulting team.